The morning had started quietly, the kind of stillness that feels like the land itself is holding its breath. Gray clouds blanketed the sky, heavy and unbroken, casting a silver light across the rolling hills and cedar trees that surrounded the Standing Pines Reservation. It was Unity Day, the most sacred gathering of the year, a time when elders told stories beside the fire, when warriors from the past and present stood in silence to honor those who came before them, a time when children wore feathers and beads their grandmothers had stitched by hand, and when the drumbeat of ancestry echoed across the valley like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Chief Running Hawk, tall and weathered, stood at the center of the sacred circle. A patch of earth kept clear all year round. He was dressed in full regalia, a buckskin coat with eagle feathers embroidered into its seams, turquoise beads that caught what little light the sky offered, and the ceremonial staff that had been passed down from chief to chief since the time before maps. His headdress was older than most men living, its feathers faded from years beneath the sun, snow, and wind. Each feather was earned, not given, each one a symbol of sacrifice, leadership, and spirit. Though the event was one of celebration, there was a weight to this year's gathering that no one could ignore. The land had suffered, crops had failed during the last harvest, funding from the government had dried up, 3 families had left the reservation entirely. There was talk and hushed voices that this might be the last Unity Day celebrated in such form, at least for a long while, and still, the people came. From trailer homes, from dusty backroads, from houses patched together with plywood and memory. They came, mothers with babies on their backs, grandfathers leaning on canes carved from old birch trees, teens in beaded jackets and worn-out sneakers. They brought chairs, blankets, baskets of fry bread, pots of stew, and drums passed from father to son. It didn't matter that it might rain. It didn't matter that the air was heavy with grief and change. The community showed up because showing up was survival. Eli came with his Aunt June. He was only 8, with wiry limbs and a head too big for his narrow shoulders. His mother had passed when he was a toddler, and his father was someone people didn't talk about much. June, his mother's sister, had taken him in. She was quiet and strict, but she loved Eli with a fierce kind of tenderness. She dressed him that morning in a simple denim shirt and jeans, but before they left, he surprised her by tugging his grandfather's old hat from the closet and placing it on his head. It was too big and drooped over one eye, but he grinned and said, "I want to wear it for Grandpa." He always said his hat was lucky. June had stared at him for a long second before nodding once. "Then you wear it proud." They arrived early. Before the songs began, Eli watched everything with wide eyes. The elders sat in folding chairs arranged in a semicircle. The way the men tightened the skins on the big drums, the way the women lit sage and whispered prayers into the smoke. He noticed the chief, of course. Everyone did. Chief Running Hawk was a legend, a man who once marched beside activists at Wounded Knee, who had negotiated land rights with senators and fought pipelines with quiet, defiant resistance. He had faced down developers, battled addiction, and carried the loss of a son who had died serving in Afghanistan. He was a man whose spirit seemed carved from the land itself, hard, beautiful, and enduring. And yet, even he looked tired this year. Eli watched from behind June's legs as the chief moved to the center of the sacred circle. He said nothing, only raised his staff and bowed his head. The crowd responded with silence, and the drumming began a slow, steady rhythm like a distant thunder. Children weren't supposed to wander near the sacred circle unless invited. It was a space reserved for honor, memory, and ceremony. But Eli didn't feel like he was disobeying when his legs began to move. He didn't even realize he was doing it. One step, then another. His heart thudded in his chest like the drums. Something was calling him, not a voice, exactly, but a pull. Like a string inside him being tugged gently forward. June didn't notice at first. She was speaking with Mrs. Redfeather about the prayer list for the elders. By the time she looked down and saw Eli slipping through the outer ring of the crowd, her breath caught in her throat. "Eli," she whispered harshly, but he didn't turn. Instead, he stepped forward, weaving between folding chairs and elders wrapped in shawls. People began to murmur. Some shook their heads, others smiled gently. A few looked uncomfortable, but no one stopped him. Maybe they saw the same thing the chief did, a boy not acting out, but answering something sacred. Eli walked to the edge of the circle and paused. Chief Running Hawk looked at him, eyebrows raised. He hadn't said a word all morning, but now, his eyes met Eli's and the world seemed to go still. The wind rustled the trees behind the crowd. A distant hawk cried, and Eli stepped into the circle. The boy approached slowly. Every eye now locked on him. He looked up at the towering figure of the chief, whose eyes softened, though his stance remained tall and solemn. Eli reached up with both hands and lifted the old dusty cowboy hat from his head, the same one his grandfather wore every day. Before he passed, the brim trembled in his hands, and with all the innocence and courage a child could muster, he said, "Take my hat. It'll keep you safe." The crowd, gathered in solemn anticipation, was silent except for the steady rhythm of the drum and the occasional cry of a hawk echoing in the cloudy sky above. All eyes were fixed on the small figure standing just within the sacred place reserved for the elders, for the warriors, for the chief. It had never, in the memory of anyone alive, been entered uninvited by a child. And yet, Eli stood there, no hesitation in his bones, no fear showing in his face, only the quiet urgency of someone who believed, without understanding why, that what they were doing was right. Eli's boots were scuffed, the cuffs of his jeans, slightly too long, frayed at the heel. His denim shirt was buttoned wrong at the collar, and his hair stuck up in a way that showed he'd rushed to get ready. But in that moment, he didn't look clumsy or out of place. He looked determined by something bigger than himself. And in his small, outstretched hands, he held the old cowboy hat like it was a crown of feathers, like it was the most sacred thing in the world. He tilted his chin up to face the towering figure of Chief Running Hawk, who, though silent, watched the boy with a depth of attention that seemed to stop time. Eli's voice was quiet, almost too soft to hear, but it always did when words came from the soul. "Take my hat," Eli said. "It'll keep you safe." Gasps rippled through the crowd like a wave moving across a lake. Several elders leaned forward. Mothers pulled their children close. One of the younger men standing at the edge of the drumming circle blinked hard, unsure if he was witnessing a breach of sacred space or something sacred itself being born in real time. The line between the two had blurred, and no one dared move. The chief's expression changed. Not dramatically, not like the kind of surprise you'd see on someone caught off guard, but slowly, deeply, like a mountain shifting after centuries. His eyes, sharp as flint, softened not into sentiment, but into something even older. Recognition. It was as though the boy's words had struck a memory long buried under decades of leadership, ceremony, and war. In that moment, no one thought about rules. Not even the elders who had spent their lives guarding tradition with an iron sense of order. What Eli had done was beyond rule-breaking or obedience. It was an act of spirit, the kind of thing you couldn't plan or punish, the kind of thing the old stories spoke of when the Creator chose unlikely vessels to speak truth, when wisdom came not from age or rank but from purity of heart. Eli, of course, didn't know any of that. He only knew the chief had looked sad, sad, in a way that made Eli's chest feel heavy. It wasn't just that the chief had seemed tired, or that his back hunched slightly under the weight of his headdress. It wasn't just the way he looked at the land, like he could feel its pain. It was something deeper, a kind of loneliness Eli recognized, though he couldn't name it. The same kind he saw in the mirror sometimes, in the quiet of early mornings when Aunt June wasn't awake yet, and the house felt too big for just the two of them. So he offered what he had. The hat, his grandfather's, the hat that still smelled faintly of pipe smoke and cedar, the one he wore during thunderstorms because it made him feel brave, the one he placed over his heart when praying to the ancestors. It wasn't fancy. The stitching along the brim was coming loose. The color had faded from dark brown to something almost honey-colored, but it was precious. And he gave it up. Not for attention. Not for praise, but because something inside him whispered that the chief needed protection, not from bullets or sickness or cold, but from something worse, the weight of despair. The chief stood still for a long moment, staring at the boy. Then he knelt slowly, reverently, as if kneeling before something sacred. He reached out with weathered hands, rough from decades of labor, and accepted the hat. He didn't place it on his head. Not yet. Instead, he held it over his chest, like one would cradle a wounded bird. The drumbeat faded into silence, as if even the ancestors were holding their breath. Eli remained where he stood, uncertain now. Had he done something wrong? The chief reached out, not to reprimand, but to rest a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You are brave," he said quietly. The words meant only for Eli. "And your heart is strong." Eli blinked. His hands were suddenly empty, and the cool air touched his forehead where the hat used to sit. He looked down, then back up at the chief. "It's my lucky hat," he whispered, as if that explained everything. Chief Running Hawk smiled, then soft and sad, and full of something ancient. "Then, I am lucky to have it." From the crowd, Aunt June stepped forward, worry etched in her face. But one of the elders touched her arm gently. "Let him be," the old woman said. "Something greater is at work." And so Eli stood beside the chief, barefoot now. The boots he'd outgrown had pinched his feet and come off while walking. The boy and the old warrior stood together in the center of the sacred circle, and no one dared interrupt. A storm threatened in the sky above, but the winds calmed. The boy's offering, simple, heartfelt, uncalculated, had stilled something even greater than weather. It had stilled the grief in the chief's chest. And for the first time in years, Chief Running Hawk felt hope, not from a speech, not from a council decision, not from a treaty signed with shaky promises, but from a child. And from a hat, a child's gift. Unburdened by ego or tradition. Child who believed, wholly and without doubt, that a hat could protect someone from sadness. And maybe, just maybe, it could. Because love, when given freely, changes things. The moment Eli handed the chief his grandfather's weathered cowboy hat lingered in the air, like a suspended note in a sacred song, unresolved, vibrating with possibility. It was one of those silences where time stops breathing, where every and old, strong, and wary feels the pull of something too ancient to name. The crowd stood still, their murmurs long gone, as if some invisible barrier had closed the circle around the boy and the chief, making them untouchable. Holy. Chief Running Hawk looked down at the boy, then at the hat resting gently in his hands. The chief's fingers trembled ever so slightly, just a whisper of movement, like the first breeze before a summer storm. He had held many things in his life: weapons during battle, the hands of dying friends, treaties that brought promises, only to break them later, and the first breath of his son. But never something like this. It wasn't just a hat. It was trust. It was innocence. It was a prayer from a child who saw something in him, a need he hadn't dared name, and the weight of it. The weight wasn't in the material. It was in the meaning. As Eli looked up, his small face expectant but calm, something inside the chief broke. Not in a way that shattered, but in a way that opened. Something cracked in the bedrock of his spirit. Not pain, exactly, but the memory of it, the years of silent carrying. The long nights speaking to the ancestors and hearing no reply. The burden of leading a community through poverty, displacement, addiction, and now disconnection. The children no longer danced as they once had. The songs were being forgotten, the language spoken in fragments, preserved only in recordings and fading memories. Running Hawk had tried to carry it all, every tradition, every story, every scar. But no one had ever said, "Let me help," until now, and it had come, not from a warrior, nor a councilman, nor even a fellow elder. It had come from an 8-year-old boy. The chief dropped to one knee, not as a symbol, but because his body demanded it. His eyes burned with unshed tears. His hands, so often used for defense, for resistance, for signing endless documents filled with false promises, those hands now simply held a boy's hat. A hat that still held the scent of cedar smoke, earth, and hope. The crowd, still frozen, in reverent silence, watched as the chief pressed the hat to his chest. His other hand rose to his own headdress, the ceremonial crown of feathers and beads, worn only on the most sacred days. And then he removed it. Gasps rippled through the people. No chief in living memory had ever taken off his headdress during ceremony, not for anything, not for anyone. It was a sacred emblem of leadership, of ancestral blessing, of survival itself. Removing it during ritual could be seen as abdication, or worse, as spiritual disruption. But Running Hawk didn't see it that way. He saw it as transformation. He saw the boy brave and full of belief, not just as a child, but as the seed of something new. He looked into Eli's eyes uncorrupted by history or cynicism, and for the first time in decades, he saw the future reflected back at him, not as a burden, but as a gift. "I give this," the chief said, voice steady, but quiet enough that people had to lean in to hear, not because tradition demands it, but because the ancestors do. Then he reached out with both hands and, ever so gently, placed the headdress on Eli's head. It slipped forward, too large for his small frame, and covered part of the boy's face. But he didn't move. He didn't smile. He stood perfectly still, as if instinctively aware of the magnitude of what was happening. The drums had long since stopped. The wind had ceased. Not even the birds in the nearby trees made a sound. The world seemed to bow in silence. A child in a headdress, a chief, with a cowboy hat over his heart. Two symbols reversed. 2 generations bridged. The chief rose slowly. Now hatless, now humbled, his long braids brushing the shoulders of his tunic. In his weathered hands, he clutched the hat like it was a sacred scroll. When he spoke, his voice filled the air, not booming, but carrying, like smoke rising from a ceremonial fire. "This boy," he said, turning to face the people, "has done what many of us forgot how to do." He saw pain, and did not look away. He saw an elder, and did not wait to be told to honor. He gave without knowing the weight of what he was giving. And because of that, it means even more. Murmurs returned to the crowd, but no one spoke loudly. A few elders wept quietly. Others nodded, their eyes bright with tears. Children watched, confused but mesmerized, and parents held them close, sensing they would one day tell this story, around a fire, perhaps in a classroom, perhaps just as a memory passed on before sleep. The chief continued, "This headdress has always been worn by those chosen to carry the burden of memory, but burden is too heavy for one person. It belongs to all of us. And today, a child reminded me that leadership is not about standing above, it's about walking beside." He turned and rested a hand on Eli's shoulder again. "I will keep your hat, young one," he said, not as protection, but as a reminder that courage comes in small hands. That spirit cannot be taught, it must be felt, and that the sacred will appear where we least expect it. Eli finally spoke. "Can I keep the feathers?" There was a beat of silence, then a wave of laughter, full-throated, cleansing laughter. It rolled through the crowd like thunder, the kind of laughter that lifts the weight off your back for a moment and lets you breathe deeper. The chief grinned. "You may keep the feathers," he said, "but you must also keep the promise." "What promise?" "To always see others, to always give what you can, and to never let the stories die." Eli nodded solemnly. though he didn't fully understand. He only knew something had changed. Not just in the chief, not just in the people, but in him. He felt taller, he felt seen, he felt like part of something ancient and alive, and all it took was a hat. In the days that followed Eli's gift, the story traveled faster than wildfire in dry summer grass. First, it echoed through the small community, passed from porch to porch, whispered across dinner tables, retold by children who hadn't fully understood what they'd witnessed but felt its sacredness in their bones. Then it reached other towns. Soon, journalists came knocking, asking about the boy and the chief, cameras trailing behind them like hungry shadows. But the heart of what happened wasn't something that could be captured in a soundbite or headline. What took place in the sacred circle that day wasn't a performance. It was a shift in history. To the outside world, it may have seemed like a sweet moment, a powerful photo opportunity, a child giving a hat to an elder, a community leader bestowing a headdress on a child. But those who understood the sacredness of their culture, who carried the wounds of broken treaties, eroded traditions, and generations of spiritual trauma, saw something else entirely, a bridge built across time, across loss, across the silence that had settled like a fog over many native communities for too long. Chief Running Hawk, once a stoic symbol of unshakable leadership, became the embodiment of humility. In the weeks after the ceremony, he traveled not for politics or public relations but to visit elders, to sit with the youth, and to listen, always with Eli's hat tucked under his arm or resting nearby. That simple cowboy hat became a relic, of sorts, not because of its material value but because of what it represented, a return to truth. 2. Vulnerability. 2. Spirit-led leadership. Eli, for his part, didn't know what to make of the attention. Reporters came. People wrote songs about him. A sketch of him wearing the headdress, the brim of the hat peeking out from underneath, became a viral image on social media. Artists painted murals of the moment. But Eli just wanted to go fishing with Aunt June or feed the goats at sunrise. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't feel wise or powerful. He just felt like himself. Still, something inside him had changed. There were moments when he'd wake up and feel the weight of the headdress in his dreams, as if the feathers had wrapped around his spirit and whispered old truths to him as he slept. He began asking Aunt June questions about his ancestors, about the songs they sang, about the language they spoke, about the stories she hadn't told him yet. He listened more. He grew quieter, not because he was shy, but because he was listening for things people didn't always say with words. And he was listening to, he began opening council meetings, not with policy, but with a moment of silence for the ones yet born and the ones already gone. He invited the youth to speak, not after the adults were finished, but first. He changed the order of things not to be rebellious, but because he had remembered something, that the future didn't belong to him, it belonged to those coming next, and he needed to listen to them if he wanted to lead them. A new tradition was born. Every season, the community gathered for what became known as the Circle of Gifts, a ceremony where children were invited to give something meaningful to an elder, and in return, elders gave something sacred to the child. Sometimes it was a prayer stone. Other times, a feather from a hawk that had flown over the river that morning. Sometimes it was just a story, spoken in trembling words, about how they had survived the boarding schools or the flood of 72, or the hunger winters of old. But every gift, no matter how small, was sacred, and always. At the center of the circle was Eli's hat. It was never displayed in a glass case or locked away in a museum. It sat on a simple wooden table, open to touch, open to everyone. That sometimes the most powerful things come from the smallest hands. Visitors came from all over the country. Some expected a monument or a museum. Instead, they found a community more alive than ever. Drumming circles returned to the evenings. Elders who had grown quiet began teaching again. Children danced with the fierce joy of belonging, and so many people began to believe again. Not in politics, not in promises, but in each other. At one such Circle of Gifts ceremony, nearly a year after Eli had first stepped into the sacred space, something unexpected happened. Eli didn't bring the headdress, he brought a story. He stood before the gathered crowd. Older now by a year, but with eyes just as bright. The firelight flickered across his face as he began to speak, not with grandeur, but with heart. I didn't know what would happen when I gave the chief my hat, he said. I just felt like he needed it. Like maybe it could help. He paused, then looked toward the elders. I didn't know it would change everything, but I'm glad it did. A rustling moved through the crowd, emotional, breathless. Sometimes, he continued, I think grown-ups forget that we kids can see things too. Maybe not the same way. Maybe not with the same words, but we feel stuff. We know when someone is hurting and we want to help. We just don't always know how. He looked down at his hands for a moment, then up again. But you helped me know how. There were no dry eyes. Not even the stoic ones. The chief stood, not as a leader, but as one of many. He walked over to Eli, kneeled beside him, and spoke, with the reverence of someone who had learned not to lead from the front, but from the heart. You didn't just give me a hat, he said softly. You gave me back myself. They embraced not as symbol and legend, but as human and human. And in that embrace, something else was healed. For years, Native communities across the continent had wrestled with disconnection, generational trauma, forced assimilation, substance abuse, and the quiet erasure of language and ritual. But here, in this one small place, a child had sparked a reversal, not by policy, but by love. Soon, the story of Eli and the chief became a lesson taught in schools, not as a fairy tale, but as modern history. Colleges invited Chief Running Hawk and Eli to speak together, always reminding the audience that tradition isn't just in the past, it lives and breathes and grows when we make space for it. Philanthropic groups asked how they could help. Some wanted to build monuments, others offered grants. But Chief Running Hawk declined most of them. Honor us by listening, he said. Honor us by remembering. Don't build statues. Build relationships. In time, other tribes began their own circle of gifts, ceremonies. The idea spread beyond Native communities into churches, schools, even town councils. The belief that children had wisdom worth honoring became more than a concept. It became action. It became ceremony, and, at the heart of it all, one boy, one hat, one moment of truth. Years later, Eli, now a young man, still kept the headdress in a box beneath his bed. He didn't wear it often. He didn't parade it around. He didn't need to. What it meant lived in his bones. Now it had shaped who he became: a bridgewalker, a listener, a speaker of both the old stories and the ones yet written. The cowboy hat, by then, was worn thin. The brim had softened from being passed between so many hands. The scent of cedar had faded, replaced by time and touch. But it remained, because sacred things don't fade, they echo. And Eli's gift would echo for generations.